Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in American history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this narration. Virginia, 1860. The Gregory plantation stood imposing against the Albemarle County hills, its white columns gleaming beneath the merciless summer sun. Behind the estate's delicate lace curtains, identical twins Eugenia and Eleanor Gregory harbored an unholy secret, a pact forbidden by both law and nature. Their object of desire, Solomon, an enslaved man whose rare literacy had positioned him in the master's personal study. What began as one sister's forbidden fascination evolved into something far more sinister. The first evidence emerged in the Richmond Enquirer of October 17, 1860, a cryptic wedding announcement that would remain buried in county archives until a historian's chance discovery revealed the twins' unthinkable arrangement over a century later. The Gregory name carried substantial weight throughout Virginia society, their lineage tracing back to the earliest colonial settlements and their fortune built upon the fertile soil of Albemarle County, where tobacco and cotton flourished under the labor of nearly 100 enslaved souls. Colonel Jasper Gregory, a widower whose wife Mary Ann perished while bringing their identical daughters into the world in 1838, had raised the girls with an unusually progressive emphasis on education, a tendency that manifested in his peculiar insistence that select individuals among those he enslaved should learn to read and write for the purposes of household management, account-keeping, and correspondence. This deviation from Southern norms was tolerated given the colonel's otherwise impeccable standing, his generous contributions to the Confederate cause, and his public adherence to the racial hierarchies that defined antebellum Virginia. According to plantation purchase records discovered during an archival inventory conducted by the University of Virginia in 1973, Solomon was acquired specifically for his literacy from the neighboring Whitmore estate in October 1858 for the considerable sum of $1,800, nearly double the typical price. The documentation, with its yellowed edges and fading ink, noted his exceptional abilities with letters and figures and suitable temperament for household duties. Most revealing was Colonel Gregory's unusual instruction, recorded by the plantation overseer Thomas Willoughby in a daily log entry: "New boy Solomon to be quartered in the east wing adjacent to the library, not in field quarters." Colonel insists on immediate assignment to assist with correspondence and catalog the family collection of books and maps. This unprecedented placement of an enslaved man within the main house would later prove the first step in a sequence of boundary-crossing events that would ultimately consume all involved. The first indications of Eugenia Gregory's dangerous fascination with Solomon emerged in fragments of her leather-bound diary recovered from a trunk in the attic of the former Gregory estate during its conversion to a historical museum in 1965. The faded violet ink preserving her increasingly fevered observations from the spring of 1859. The new house servant S. possesses a dignity that seems to transcend his station, reads an entry dated March 12th, followed by more frequent and intimate notations as the weeks progressed. "Today S. read aloud from Father's copy of Milton. His voice contains depths I have never encountered in any of Father's associates." And later, more daringly, "I lingered in the library today solely to observe S. at his cataloging work. When our hands brushed across the same volume, I felt a tremor that both frightens and exhilarates me." Solomon's history, pieced together from slave transaction records discovered in the Whitmore family papers donated to the Virginia Historical Society in 1934, revealed his birth on a small Maryland plantation, where the mistress's unmarried sister had secretly taught him to read alongside her own children, a dangerous gift that ultimately led to his sale further south following her death when his literacy was discovered by the master. Martha Williams, the Gregory household's formidable housekeeper, who had served the family since before the twins' birth, provided critical insights through her remarkable testimony to the Albemarle County Historical Society in 1901, when, at age 87, she finally broke her decades of silence. Those girls, identical as two drops of water, were always peculiar from childhood, finishing each other's thoughts, sharing secrets no one else could understand. But it was the way Miss Eugenia's eyes followed that educated Negro man around the house that first troubled my spirit. Martha's observations carried particular weight given the unusual freedom the twins enjoyed on the plantation, with Colonel Gregory's Confederate political aspirations requiring frequent extended travel to Richmond, Charleston, and even Washington. The day-to-day management of household affairs fell increasingly to his daughters, who at 21 possessed a degree of autonomy unusual for unmarried women of their station. The colonel being gone sometimes 3 weeks out of 4, Martha's testimony continued, left those girls to their own devices far too often, with only myself and Mr. Willoughby, the overseer, as proper supervision. And neither of us had any authority to question the daughters of the house about their comings and goings, even when Miss Eugenia began requesting Solomon's assistance with literary matters long into the evening hours. By late summer of 1859, Eugenia Gregory's private writings reveal a dangerous acceleration of her forbidden feelings, her diary entries becoming increasingly explicit, despite the catastrophic consequences discovery would bring. I can no longer pretend that my interest in S remains academic when our discussions turn to poetry. Particularly Byron's more passionate verses, I find myself unable to maintain the distance propriety demands. The pivotal moment came on September 3rd, according to Eleanor Gregory's own journal, discovered separately in a collection of family papers donated to the Richmond Historical Society in 1943. Tonight I discovered Eugenia in the library long after midnight, seated inappropriately close to Solomon as he read to her by candlelight, their heads inclined toward one another in a manner that cannot be misinterpreted. When she saw me standing in the doorway, the look that passed between us contained both defiance and pleading. A letter dated the 17th of October, 1859, found in the county archives from the twins' maternal aunt, Margaret Thornton of Charlottesville, to Colonel Gregory, hints at growing concerns beyond the plantation's walls. Your daughter's unusual attachment to household matters, particularly library affairs, has become a subject of gentle questioning among our circle. While I defended their scholarly interests as a credit to your progressive approach to female education, I feel compelled to suggest that more time in suitable society might be advantageous for young ladies of their station and marriageable age. The first documented instance of the twins deliberately exploiting their identical appearance, a strategy that would later prove central to their extraordinary deception, appears in the testimony of Robert Jenkins, a visiting tutor who provided monthly instruction in French and mathematics, recorded in his private correspondence to a colleague in Boston. The Gregory household presents a most curious situation wherein I can never be entirely certain which of the identical Miss Gregorys I am instructing at any given moment. They switch places with such frequency and skill that even their father cannot reliably distinguish between them, a confusion they seem to cultivate deliberately and with some amusement. The plantation's account books from this period show a curious pattern of purchases. Additional candles allocated specifically to the library, fine stationery ordered in unusual quantities, and most tellingly, 2 identical emerald green dresses commissioned from the finest dressmaker in Charlottesville, items that would later feature prominently in witness accounts of the twins' elaborate deception. The most extraordinary aspect of the Gregory case emerged during the 1932 renovation of the plantation's main house, when workers discovered a loose floorboard beneath the library window seat concealing a small tin box containing fragments of paper covered in a refined, educated hand, Solomon's hidden writings that offered unprecedented insight into the mind of a man caught in an impossible situation. I am divided between terror and a hope I dare not name, for the attention of the Gregory sisters promises either my destruction or a path to freedom I had ceased to imagine possible. These remarkable documents, now preserved in the Smithsonian's collection of African American historical artifacts, reveal Solomon's background in greater detail than any transaction record could provide. his original name before being sold away from his family at age 12, his secret education by a sympathetic minister's wife, and his carefully concealed literacy that became both his greatest vulnerability and strongest asset. Miss Eugenia's interest first appeared scholarly, then sentimental in a manner I recognized from previous households, dangerous yet potentially manageable. But Miss Eleanor's subsequent attention has created a situation beyond my experience or understanding. One fragment reads, continuing, "Their identical appearance creates moments of genuine confusion, yet increasingly I suspect deliberate substitution occurring. A strategy whose purpose remains opaque, yet terrifying in its implications." Solomon's writings reveal his constant calculation of survival against his dreams of eventual freedom. I balance daily between cultivating their dangerous favor and the genuine intellectual communion I have been denied throughout my captivity. The sisters speak of books and ideas as equals, yet I never forget the fundamental inequality of our positions, nor the catastrophic consequences should Colonel Gregory discover our interactions. Rumors of the unusual dynamics within the main house began circulating among the prize, enslaved community on the plantation, preserved in oral histories collected by Federal Writers Project interviewers in the 1,930 seconds, including the testimony of Esther Williams, who had been a young house servant during this period. Folk started noticing how those twin misses would switch their dresses and their hair sometimes, confusing everybody about which one was where, particularly when one would be in the library with Solomon while the other entertained visitors in the parlor, and Solomon himself seemed caught between fear and something else we couldn't name, growing thinner despite receiving extra food from the missus's own plates. By early spring of 1860, a most extraordinary arrangement had developed within the Gregory household, documented obliquely through the intersection of multiple historical sources. Eleanor's journal entries became deliberately cryptic, referring to our shared understanding regarding S and the schedule we have devised for mutual satisfaction, while household staff later testified to a bewildering pattern of behavior wherein the twins would exchange clothing and hairstyles multiple times daily, creating an atmosphere of perpetual confusion about which sister was engaged in which activity at any given moment. A strategy that reached its apotheosis when visitors arrived at the plantation, with one twin invariably claiming a migraine necessitating rest, while the other entertained, only for them to mysteriously exchange places without guests noticing the substitution. The plantation's meticulously kept household accounting books, preserved in the Virginia State Archives, reveal telling anomalies during this period. Entries for special provisions, library assistant, showing quantities of wine, imported coffee, and preserved fruits normally reserved exclusively for the family table. Requisitions for unusually fine clothing marked simply as necessary for household presentation, and most damning, a receipt for a gold pocket watch from a Richmond jeweler with the enigmatic notation S, reward for exceptional service in Eugenia's distinctive handwriting. Dr. William Hartwell, the Gregory family physician who attended the plantation monthly to address the colonel's chronic gout and other household medical concerns, unwittingly documented the progression of this unprecedented situation through his private case notes, discovered among his effects following his death in 1879. The Gregory twins continued to present a most perplexing medical circumstance. While physically identical in every respect observable to medical science, their temperaments historically differed substantially, with Miss Eugenia demonstrating a nervous excitability while Miss Eleanor maintained a cooler, more analytical disposition. Yet recently this distinction has blurred considerably, with both young ladies exhibiting similar patterns of flushed appearance, rapid pulse, and distracted attention during examination. A particularly revealing entry from May 1860 notes, "Most curious behavior observed today. Upon arrival found Miss Eleanor in the library with the literate enslaved man Solomon, engaged in animated discussion of botanical classifications, yet upon returning from the colonel's bedchamber 1 hour later, found what appeared to be the same sister in identical dress now claiming to be Miss Eugenia, Though the enslaved man addressed her with the same familiarity, I begin to wonder if some game is being played at my expense. As July turned to August, the pressure of maintaining their secret arrangement while deflecting suitors drove the Gregory twins to contemplate an action unprecedented in Virginia society: the formalization of their shared relationship with Solomon through some manner of ceremony, a desperate plan documented in Eleanor's journal entries from this period, which grow increasingly fervent and philosophical in tone. We have determined that our arrangement, though incomprehensible to the world, contains its own form of moral truth. If the laws of man declare it impossible for Eugenia and me to both claim attachment to S, then we shall appeal to a higher authority for recognition of what our hearts have already decreed. The twins' rationalization of their extraordinary decision reflected both the moral contradictions of their time and their speed. Particular psychological entwinement, with Eleanor writing, "We who shared a womb, who have never known separation from each other, now find ourselves equally unable to separate from him. Perhaps Providence made us identical for this very purpose, to love as one being rather than two." Their search for spiritual validation led them to approach Reverend Thomas Blackwood, the elderly minister of a small Methodist chapel located on the periphery of Charlottesville. Known for his unorthodox views on slavery despite his Southern heritage, church records discovered during a denominational history project in 1921 contain cryptic entries from August 1860, noting private counsel provided to the Gregory sisters on matters of conscience too delicate for general discussion, and extensive theological debate regarding the primacy of divine love over earthly convention. The Reverend's personal diary, found among his granddaughter's possessions in 1943, offers tantalizing hints at his reaction to their unprecedented proposal. Today I encountered perhaps the most extraordinary theological quandary of my 40 years in ministry: identical twin souls seeking blessing for an arrangement that violates every social convention yet contains, at its core, a genuine commitment to love and fidelity that I cannot in good conscience entirely condemn. I provided no answers, but rather questions for their examination before God. Plantation records indicate that during this same period, Solomon was granted an unusual 3-day absence for special errands in Charlottesville, while the household accounts show purchases of 2 identical gold bands from a jeweler there, listed misleadingly as sewing thimbles in the ledger, items that would later feature prominently in the shocking announcement that brought their secret world crashing into public view. The fateful wedding announcement that shattered the Gregory family's standing in Virginia society appeared in the Richmond Inquirer on October 17, 1860. A small notice on the 3rd page that would have escaped attention were it not for its extraordinary content. The Mrs. Eugenia and Eleanor Gregory of Albemarle County announced their spiritual union in matrimony with Mr. Solomon of the same household, a ceremony privately conducted in accordance with their mutual devotion and Christian principles. How such an announcement, violating every social taboo of antebellum Virginia, came to be published remained a mystery, until the discovery in 1978 of the memoir of Thomas Carter, grandson of James Carter, who had worked as a typesetter at the Inquirer in 1860. My grandfather often recounted his most unusual professional experience: the day 2 identical young ladies in fine emerald dresses visited the newspaper office late in the afternoon, when most editors had departed. Presenting a handwritten announcement and an excessive payment in gold coins with instructions that it be published precisely as written, assuming they were playing some society prank, yet dazzled by their beauty and the generous payment, he included it in the next day's edition without editorial review. The newspaper's internal records, preserved in the Virginia Press Association archives, document the aftermath: a hastily called meeting of the editorial staff, the immediate dismissal of James Carter for gross negligence in publication standards, and a retraction prepared for the following day's edition that mysteriously never appeared. A telegram discovered in the newspaper's financial records, sent to the Inquirer's owner who was visiting family in Baltimore, suggests external intervention. Gregory announcement: disaster stop: friends in government. Demand no retraction to avoid further attention. Stop. Consider Carter terminated immediately. The twins' calculated timing proved strategic. Colonel Gregory was attending a secessionist convention in Charleston that week, learning of the announcement only through a letter from a horrified colleague that reached him 3 days after publication, by which point the notice had been seen throughout Richmond's elite circles and copies dispatched to other major Southern newspapers, though most refrained from reprinting what they assumed must be a scandalous prank or malicious forgery. The announcement ignited an immediate firestorm throughout Virginia society, with the Richmond Sentinel reporting that certain circles of the capital find themselves consumed with discussion of an announcement so shocking its authenticity cannot be credited, yet so specific its intent cannot be misunderstood. Colonel Gregory's frantic return journey from Charleston was documented in stagecoach records and a series of increasingly desperate telegrams sent ahead to political Bender allies, culminating in his arrival at the family estate where, according to household staff testimony later collected by federal investigators, he stormed through the house in a state approaching madness, demanding explanations and threatening violence. His public strategy emerged in a hastily drafted letter distributed to prominent Virginia families, preserved in multiple private collections, wherein he claimed, "My daughters have been victims of a malicious hoax perpetrated by enemies of our family, and by extension, enemies of our Southern way of life. The announcement was placed without their knowledge or consent, possibly by abolitionist sympathizers seeking to undermine the reputation of a family dedicated to the Confederate cause." The private correspondence between neighboring plantation families tells a different story. However, as revealed in the Beaumont-Caldwell letters discovered in 1992, with Harrison Beaumont writing, "The Gregory scandal confirms my earlier suspicions of improper relations within that household. Multiple reliable witnesses now report observing the twins in unnaturally intimate situations with the educated slave, behavior that explains their peculiar resistance to suitable marriage arrangements." The official dimension of the scandal emerged through the recovered casebook of Sheriff Daniel Monroe, whose entry dated the 21st of October 1860 notes, "Conducted official inquiry at Gregory Plantation following numerous reports of impropriety and possible violation of statutes prohibiting intimate relations across racial boundaries. Colonel Gregory prevented private 4 interviews with his daughters or the enslaved man in question, presenting instead signed affidavits from both young ladies denying any inappropriate behavior and attributing the announcement to Northern agitators targeting their father's Confederate sympathies." Monroe's private notes, discovered separately among family papers, reveal his skepticism. The identical appearance of the Gregory twins created unusual investigative difficulties, as I could never be certain which sister I was addressing at any moment, and their synchronized responses suggested careful rehearsal. More troubling was the absence of the enslaved man Solomon, whom Colonel Gregory claimed had been temporarily transferred to their distant tobacco holdings for agricultural consultation, a transparent falsehood given the season. Precisely 1 week after the scandalous announcement appeared, the Gregory plantation awoke to a discovery that transformed public scandal into criminal investigation. The twins and Solomon had vanished sometime during the night, an escape meticulously planned and executed with remarkable precision according to the subsequent report filed by Sheriff Monroe, which noted that the fugitives departed with minimal belongings, suggesting long contemplation of their flight, and disabled the plantation's messenger horses to prevent immediate pursuit. Colonel Gregory's increasingly unhinged correspondence from this period reveals his desperate efforts to locate his daughters while simultaneously suppressing the true nature of their disappearance. Writing to the governor, "My daughters have been abducted by the cunning slave who previously ingratiated himself through false demonstrations of literacy and religious devotion. I require state resources to recover these innocent young women from his," quote, "malevolent influence before irreparable damage is done to their persons and reputations." The first concrete evidence of their journey emerged in stagecoach company records discovered during a transportation history project in 1947, showing 3 passengers, 2 ladies traveling with their manservant, purchasing tickets from Charlottesville to Baltimore on October 25th. Having paid an unusual premium for private accommodation and minimal stops, the disguise they employed was documented in the memoir of Abigail Winters, a fellow traveler who wrote, "The most curious party joined our northbound journey at Charlottesville. Twin sisters dressed in mourning clothes with heavy black veils obscuring their features, claiming to be widows of officers killed in frontier conflicts, accompanied by a servant they introduced as a free man of color acting as their secretary and business representative. Something in their manner suggested persons of quality fallen upon desperate circumstances, though their refined speech occasionally faltered in telling details. Colonel Gregory's political connections extended his search beyond Virginia, as evidenced by a telegram discovered in federal archives, sent from the Confederate sympathizer Senator James Morton to authorities in Washington. Alert all stations, stop 3 fugitives from Virginia, stop twin females aged 22, fair complexion, auburn hair, traveling with mulatto male, aged approximately 30. Stop females may claim widowhood or use false names, stop apprehend. And hold for Virginia authorities, stop substantial reward, stop. The escalating national crisis that would soon erupt into full-scale civil war provided an unexpected shield for the fugitives. As political tensions increasingly overshadowed personal scandals in public discourse, the Richmond papers that had breathlessly followed the Gregory affair in October now devoted their columns to secession debates by Gregory affair. December, with South Carolina's departure from the Union pushing the story to obscurity, Colonel Gregory found himself trapped in an impossible division of loyalties, his correspondence from this period revealing a man increasingly unhinged by competing obligations. My military appointment to the Confederate command structure demands my full attention at precisely the moment my family crisis reaches its apex. I cannot abandon the cause of Southern independence. Yet neither can I accept the theft of my daughters by a man who was legally my property. His solution, hiring a series of increasingly dubious private investigators to continue the search while he fulfilled his military duties, proved ineffective, as documented in expense records showing payments to individuals later identified as notorious bounty hunters, accompanied by frustrated notations. Second agent reports false trail in Philadelphia, funds exhausted with no result, and Baltimore investigation abandoned due to increasing Northern hostility towards Southern interests. The most tantalizing evidence of the trio's successful passage into Northern territory emerged decades later, during a scholarly review of Union intelligence archives, which uncovered a field report submitted by Agent 27, a spy embedded in border regions who noted, "Among refugees crossing into Pennsylvania, observe unusual party consisting of Southern aristocrat twin ladies traveling with colored companion. Group demonstrates excessive education and refinement inconsistent with typical processed. Fugitive slaves, yet displays intimate familiarity, suggesting relationship beyond conventional household roles. Ladies maintain elaborate deception regarding identities, presenting different names and backstories to different parties. Recommend no intervention as group's movements suggest valuable intelligence on Southern high society may be forthcoming." By April 1861, when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, the search for the Gregory twins had been effectively suspended. Their father now fully occupied with military preparations as Virginia formally joined the Confederacy, a development that sealed the national division and, ironically, created the very conditions that would enable the fugitives to establish new identities in Northern territory, protected by the chaos of a nation fracturing along the same fault lines that had once constrained their forbidden relationship. The fugitives' trail vanished entirely during the war years, only to resurface in the 1870 federal census records for Philadelphia's Spring Garden District. Discovered by genealogist Martha Harrington during research on displaced Southern families in 1983, which listed Eleanor and Eugenia Bennett, unmarried sisters, sharing a modest row house with Solomon Bennett. Widower, the deliberate adoption of Solomon's given name as their shared surname representing perhaps their most audacious act of self-reinvention. Property records from the Philadelphia County Clerk's Office revealed that the small 3-story brick home at 1422 Parish Street had been purchased in 1,867 inches, the name of Solomon Bennett Freeman, with a deed notation indicating the funds originated from family inheritance held in trust by First Bank of Boston, suggesting the twins had somehow accessed their maternal legacy despite their 80 fugitive status, likely through Northern abolitionist connections. The unusual household arrangement attracted inevitable curiosity in their new community, addressed through an elaborate fiction documented in the diary of neighboring resident Margaret Whitfield. The Bennett sisters explained their curious domestic situation as the result of tragedy. They claimed to be caring for their deceased cousin's husband, a free man of color who had established himself in business before the war, following a deathbed promise that has bound them to a lifetime of shared familial obligation. This carefully constructed narrative allowed the trio to inhabit a liminal space in Philadelphia's post-war society, where their refined Southern accents and education marked them as displaced aristocracy, while Solomon's presence could be explained through complex family obligations rather than the unthinkable truth. Church records from the First Presbyterian Church of Philadelphia list all three as members beginning in 1868, with Solomon described as businessman and carpenter, and the sisters as teachers of music and literature, occupations that maintained their distance from conventional society while utilizing their considerable education. Most revealing were accounts in the memoir of Harriet Stanton, a noted abolitionist whose Philadelphia home served as a gathering place for progressive thinkers. The Bennett household represents the war's most fascinating transformation. Two daughters of the Confederacy's elite, now living in dignified simplicity alongside the man they once called property. All three bound by an attachment whose precise nature remains deliberately ambiguous, yet whose depth is unmistakable in their coordinated movements, shared glances, and the protective formation they maintain in public, with the sisters flanking their companion like sentries guarding a treasure. The first documented return of either twin to Virginia occurred in March 1882, when probate records from Albemarle County Courthouse reveal that Eleanor Gregory, now Bennett, journeyed south alone following notification of Colonel Jasper Gregory's death from consumption at a Confederate veteran's home in Richmond, where he had lived in diminished circumstances following the war's destruction of his plantation and fortune. The legal transcripts of the inheritance proceedings, preserved in county archives, demonstrate Eleanor's extraordinary caution in navigating questions about her 2-decade absence. When directly questioned by Judge William Harrington about her current residence and marital status, she provided only the vaguest responses, stating, "I maintain a modest household in Philadelphia with my sister," and deflecting inquiries about Solomon by referring to our longtime family associate who manages practical matters, answers technically truthful yet deliberately opaque. The proceedings were complicated by the Colonel's final will, drafted in 1865, which specifically disinherited "my daughters who have abandoned their family, heritage, and racial dignity." Yet Virginia law still entitled them to portions of his remaining property, absent male heirs, a legal contingency that brought Eleanor reluctantly back to the society that had once hunted them as, quote, fugitives. A remarkably candid letter discovered in the Thornton family papers in 1994, written by Eleanor's maternal cousin Rebecca Thornton to her daughter following a private meeting with the returned exile, provides the most intimate glimpse of Eleanor's transformation. "I scarcely recognized the woman before me as the delicate, sheltered girl who disappeared during those tumultuous days before the war. Eleanor now presents a formidable figure with penetrating eyes that evaluate everything with unsettling directness. Her speech retains its Virginian musicality, yet contains Northern crispness and efficiency. Most striking is her demeanor, simultaneously hardened by evident hardship, yet somehow at peace with choices that once scandalized our entire society." The estate settlement, finalized in April 1882, shows Eleanor strategically selecting specific family heirlooms, her mother's jewelry, selected books and art pieces, while liquidating land holdings and remaining assets. with court documents noting her unusual insistence on personally inspecting the former slave quarters and family cemetery before departing. Train passenger manifests indicate her return journey included an extended stop in Washington, D.C., where Treasury Department records show she established a secure account for the estate proceeds, effectively removing the last financial connections between the Gregory twins and their Virginia past. The Bennett household's carefully constructed public identity in post-war Philadelphia represented a masterpiece of social navigation, documented through business licenses discovered in city archives showing Solomon Bennett, master carpenter, establishing a modest workshop specializing in fine cabinetry and restoration of antique furniture, skills likely developed during his enforced service in the Gregory household that now provided legitimate income and professional standing in Northern society. City directories from 1872 through 1890 list the Mrs. Bennett Literary Salon and Lending Library at the Parish Street address, a small but well-regarded establishment where the twins leveraged their exceptional Southern education by offering carefully curated volumes and occasional literary discussions that attracted Philadelphia's progressive, intellectual circles while generating sufficient income to maintain their independence. Membership records from the First Presbyterian Church reveal their strategic community integration, with all three Bennetts participating in the congregation's abolitionist committee and educational outreach to formerly enslaved people arriving from the South, activities that established their anti-slavery credentials while creating a plausible context for their unusual household arrangement, as noted in Reverend Stillman's annual reports. The Bennett sisters and their associate Mr. Bennett demonstrate remarkable dedication to uplifting those recently delivered from bondage, their Southern background providing unique insight into the challenges facing these new arrivals. The most extraordinary artifact from this period emerged during the 1967 renovation of the Philadelphia Historical Society building, where a previously uncatalogued photograph dated 1885 was discovered within a collection of abolitionist movement documents. The sepia image shows Solomon standing in formal attire between the seated twins, all three considerably aged from their Virginia days, yet still presenting a striking trio, their positioning carefully choreographed to suggest conventional relationships while containing subtle signals visible to modern eyes. Solomon's hand rests on the back of Eleanor's chair rather than touching her directly, while Eugenia holds what appears to be a small book positioned to obscure her left hand, preventing observation of whether she wore a ring. Tax records and charitable donation receipts from this period indicate a household of modest prosperity, strategic community engagement, and careful boundary maintenance. They participated in Philadelphia society primarily through intellectual and progressive circles, where their unusual configuration would attract less scrutiny. While police incident reports note their Parish Street home maintained unusually robust locks and window coverings, suggesting continued vigilance despite their decades of successful reinvention. The first permanent separation of the extraordinary trio occurred in October 1887, when Philadelphia death records document Eleanor Bennett's passing from tuberculosis at age 49, her death certificate listing her occupation as proprietress of literary establishment and her place of birth cryptically as Virginia, with the attending physician's notes, discovered in the University of Pennsylvania Medical Archives, observing that the patient was attended with unusual devotion by her sister and male companion, whose grief appeared equal in its intensity despite their efforts at containment. Church burial records from Laurel Hill Cemetery indicate a modest but dignified funeral service, while the obituary published in the Philadelphia Inquirer made brief mention of her contribution to literary education and advancement of freedmen's causes, without reference to her Southern origins or true identity. Property records from the Philadelphia County Assessor's Office reveal that within 6 months of Eleanor's death, Eugenia and Solomon sold the Parish Street house and purchased a significantly smaller residence on Catherine Street in a predominantly working-class neighborhood, suggesting both emotional and financial adjustments following their loss. The deed for this property being the first document to explicitly list Eugenia Bennett and Solomon Bennett without qualification or explanation of their relationship, a bureaucratic oversight or deliberate choice that technically violated Pennsylvania's miscegenation statutes still in force at that time. Neighbors' accounts collected by a local historical society project in 1922 recall the pair as quiet, dignified, and inseparable, with one elderly resident noting that, though clearly from different worlds originally, they moved through daily life with the synchronized rhythms of those who have shared everything for decades. The most revealing document from this period emerged during a courthouse archive reorganization in 1953, when researchers discovered Solomon Bennett's will, drafted in 1892, which begins with the extraordinary passage, "Being of sound mind and body, I hereby bequeath all worldly possessions to Eugenia Bennett, my remaining beloved, who has shared my journey through darkness into light, with instructions that upon her passing, certain personal effects marked with the initials E.G.B. shall be buried with her, reuniting in death what life has temporarily separated from my two beloveds, though one has gone ahead." The final chapter of the Bennett household unfolded against the backdrop of America's retreat from Reconstruction's promises, with census records from 1,890 showing Eugenia, now 62, and Solomon, approximately 68, still sharing the Catherine Street home. But Philadelphia church bulletins from this period suggest a subtle shift in their public presentation, with multiple references to Mr. and Mrs. Bennett's contributions to charitable causes, indicating either community assumption or deliberate recategorization of their relationship in response to increasing racial tensions across America. Solomon's carpentry business ledgers, donated to a crafts museum in 1934 by the building's subsequent owner, who discovered them in the basement, revealed declining output through the early 1892s, with notations about increasing difficulties with vision and hand steadiness, suggesting age was finally claiming the skills that had sustained their independence. Their modest but remarkable defiance of convention during this period was documented by Julia Pemberton, a progressive social worker whose journal describes visiting the household in 1894. Despite the nation's shameful retreat from its promises to the formerly enslaved, I witness today the extraordinary dignity of an elderly couple whose relationship clearly transcends the artificial boundaries our society imposes, the tenderness with which the gray-haired black gentleman supported his elderly white companion through the garden, finishing her sentences when fatigue overtook her, spoke of decades of profound intimacy that has survived extraordinary opposition. Medical records from Pennsylvania hospital document Solomon Bennett's death from pneumonia in February 1896, with attending physician notes observing that the elderly female relative refused to leave the patient's bedside throughout his decline, reading poetry aloud until his final breath, while funeral home records indicate his burial at Laurel Hill Cemetery in a plot adjacent to Eleanor's grave, purchased decades earlier. Eugenia's rapid decline following Solomon's death manifested in both physical and psychological dimensions, with her physician's casebook noting accelerated deterioration, suggesting profound grief has compromised already fragile health, a condition that culminated in her own passing just 7 months later in September 1896. The most revealing document from this final period emerged during a 1971 university research project on women's private correspondence, which uncovered Eugenia's last letter to Sarah Hollingsworth, a Quaker friend, written 3 weeks before her death. As I prepare to join my beloveds, I find myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey from that Virginia plantation to this modest Philadelphia row house. Though society would never understand, I have lived a life of strange completeness, divided between two souls who somehow formed my whole, an arrangement born of impossible circumstances yet sustained by something I can only call divine grace despite the world's condemnation. The extraordinary story of the Gregory twins and Solomon slipped into historical obscurity through both deliberate suppression and the chaos of post-war Virginia, with Colonel Gregory's surviving relatives, primarily cousins who inherited what remained of the family holdings after Eleanor's 1882 legal settlement, systematically expunging references to the scandal from family Bibles, correspondence collections, and local historical records, as evidenced by the conspicuous removal of pages from the Gregory family Bible now preserved in the Virginia Historical Society, with entries for the twins' births intact but subsequent pages carefully excised. County historical documents from 1867 show the former Gregory plantation sold to the Whitcomb family, northern industrialists who repurposed the property for tobacco processing with no knowledge of or interest in preserving its scandalous history, while the main house, where the forbidden relationship had flourished in the library, burned under mysterious circumstances in 1870, destroying whatever physical evidence might have remained. The deliberate obscuring of the story extended to academic circles, with an 1889 comprehensive history of Albemarle County families, containing only a single footnote regarding the Gregorys, stating merely that Colonel Jasper Gregory's line ended with his generation, his daughters having relocated north following the war's conclusion. The few Virginia residents who remembered the scandal firsthand largely died during the early 1900s, their knowledge unrecorded as Southern historical societies focused on glorifying Confederate sacrifice rather than documenting antebellum scandals that complicated regional mythologies about plantation life and racial boundaries. The story might have remained permanently lost had it not been for the persistence of historical accidents and archival preservation, culminating in the watershed moment in 1967 when Margaret Williams, a 26-year-old graduate student researching Confederate press coverage of secession debates, discovered the shocking wedding announcement while reviewing microfilm records of the Richmond Inquirer at the Library of Virginia. Williams' discovery, initially dismissed by her faculty advisor as a likely prank or misinterpretation, prompted her 5-year investigation that gradually reconstructed the long-buried narrative through painstaking cross-referencing of census records, property deeds, and church documents across Virginia and Pennsylvania. Work that culminated in her groundbreaking 1973 dissertation, The Gregory Bennett Household: Transgression and Reinvention in Civil War-Era America, which reintroduced the extraordinary case to academic circles and sparked the subsequent half-century of interdisciplinary research that gradually assembled the fragmentary evidence into a coherent narrative of one of America's most unusual households. The extraordinary narrative of the Gregory twins and Solomon, pieced together across decades of historical investigation, ultimately defies the simplistic categorizations through which we typically understand antebellum relationships, revealing instead the complex humanity that persisted even within America's most rigid social hierarchies. The forbidden bonds formed in that Virginia library emerged within a system designed explicitly to deny the possibility of such connections, suggesting the inadequacy of our historical frameworks for capturing the full spectrum of human attachments that existed in the shadows of plantation society. The fundamental ambiguity regarding the twins' motivations persists despite extensive documentation, their extraordinary choice potentially representing genuine love, transcending social boundaries, a complex form of possession extending their twinship to include a third party, strategic rebellion against their father's Confederate principles, or some combination of elements for which we lack adequate vocabulary even today. Their identical nature adding yet another layer of complexity, raising unanswerable questions about whether they experienced their shared relationship as a single emotional entity or as individual women pursuing parallel forbidden attachments. Solomon's perspective remains perhaps the most elusive, his surviving writings suggesting a man navigating an impossible situation with remarkable intelligence and agency, transforming what began as inappropriate attention from his enslavers into a pathway toward freedom, education, and eventually, a life of relative dignity in Philadelphia. Yet the power imbalance inherent in their initial connection raises questions about consent and autonomy that cannot be definitively resolved across the historical distance separating their consenting world from ours. What remains beyond dispute is the extraordinary courage required for all three to abandon the only society they had known, risking death or imprisonment to create a makeshift family that defied every convention of their era. A choice commemorated today only by 3 modest graves in Philadelphia's Laurel Hill Cemetery. Positioned in a triangular arrangement and bearing only the surname Bennett with respective initials, final resting places unmarked by explanatory plaques or historical designations, yet periodically visited by descendants who leave fresh flowers in silent acknowledgement of their extraordinary ancestors whose impossible love created new bloodlines that continue into the present day. A living legacy of 3 individuals who dared to imagine relationships beyond the boundaries their society imposed, creating in their shared exile a union that has outlasted the social order that declared it an abomination.